quite a bit about China's various woes in the current geopolitical landscape, economically, socially, and you've said that at the heart of their problems is this demographic crisis. Could you give us some insight on that?
Sure. So when the world started to industrialize for real after World War II, when countries that didn't have all of the inputs suddenly could trade for them safely, everyone started to urbanize more or less at the same time. And what we discovered is the first crop of countries that did it before World War II, as they industrialized, the birth rate dropped because they moved into cities and it was harder to have kids. But after 1945, when everyone was doing it, the process sped up quite a bit. So instead of like birth rate dropping by 75% over the course of a century or two, it now dropped by that much over a generation or two. Mm-hmm. Well, the People's Republic of China was a latecomer. They didn't begin the urbanization process in force until really the 1970s, really the 1980s. And it was done at the same time that Mao was concerned that the young generation post-revolution was going to eat the country alive. So he put in the one-child policy. So we got the fastest reduction in the birth rates of any country in any region in any period in human history. Right. And with the new data that's come out in the last couple of years, it now looks like the birth rate in the urban areas of China is below one person per woman, with the birth rate in places like Beijing and Shanghai the lowest in human history. And if these numbers ultimately shake out, it means that the country actually passed its peak in population 15 years ago. And we are on track for the dissolution of China as an economic entity before the end of the decade, just because they won't have enough young people under age 40.
I've heard you say 5 to 6 years. That's quite a severe outlook for China.
Yeah, we've never had this sort of decay at this sort of pace. So admittedly, there's going to be a degree of guesswork there. But when you've got an environment when there's more people in their 70s than children and more people in their 60s than children and 50s than children, you get the idea. Yeah. This is just catastrophic. And that assumes that the new Chinese data is accurate and not just another.
Because obviously it's definitely not very trustworthy on the surface, right?
You don't lie to make it look like you're dying. You lie to make yourself look better, which makes me wonder what the reality really is.
So given their political system and compounded by various like the supply chain and market issues, what's the prognosis for China in the next 5, maybe 10 years?
We've never had a country die for demographic reasons. It's just never happened because we've never, remember, this started with industrialization and urbanization. That is, historically speaking, a relatively recent development. But what we do know is that when you run out of people who are age 20 and under, you actually get faster growth for a while because all the money you used to spend on your children, you're spending on consumption and investment. And then when you run out of people aged 40 and under, you then start seeing the explosion in labor costs. And China has now been in that environment for 20 years. So the cost of labor in China has gone up by a factor of almost 15 since the year 2000, which again, historically unprecedented. We're now in an environment where there is not a single manufacturing subsector where China is competitive. They have the advantage of the sunk industrial plant and obviously a robust subsidy system. But in a head-to-head competition with anyone, unless those subsidies get really out of control, the Chinese lose on both quality and speed. This is only going to get worse because now we're in an environment where they're running out of people age 50 and under. And that means it's eating into their skilled labor as well.
So it's kind of like the walls closing in from both sides, because you've also got these foreign investment is slowly draining out, which is keeping their manufacturing afloat, right? So not only
depends on the manufacturing. Manufacturing in China is such a weird thing. They don't actually build a whole lot. They assemble a great number of things, and I don't mean to suggest that that's nothing. But the sort of skilled labor that is required to like push the envelope technologically, they just don't have. They've got a handful of very brilliant people, but you need more than one Aristotle, and Aristotle has to have a team of interns to hand it off to it to just overuse the analogy. And the Chinese don't. You've got a vast swath of people with relatively low skill, nothing in the middle, and then a handful of people at the very top. That is not what allows a system to develop.
You've emphasized that communication between agencies and industry in China is a real big problem, right? Like there's not enough creative thinking outside of the box, and that everyone is kind of worried about what their supervisor or their supervisor is going to say, right?
Oh, certainly, and other people talk about that better than me. I mean, I would argue that they're having a hard time thinking inside the box now.
Okay.
Part of the whole rise of the cult of Xi Jinping is that there just isn't communication at all, because no one wants anything that they say, good or bad, to filter up to the big guy, because they don't know how he's going to react. And I think the spy balloon thing that the United States has recently dealt with, the disconnect between the intelligence operation that was involved and the foreign ministry that had to then deal with the fallout, it was very clear that the foreign ministry had absolutely no idea what was going on. Yeah. And we have seen things like this happen in diplomatic relations between the Chinese and the rest of the world over and over and over for the last 3 years. Just there is no coordination. There is no equivalent of the National Economic Council or the National Security Council. And that means it's just one dude making decisions in a vacuum, and that's leading to catastrophic policy outcomes.
Okay, if I can, I'd like to move on to like the broader region. So countries like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, which we'll hopefully get to more in depth, they're also facing demographic problems. But how is their situation similar or different to that of China?
Well, let's start with the most extreme case and the most similar to China, and that would be Korea. Okay. The Koreans only started their industrialization process really after the Korean War ended in the mid-50s, and really didn't start down the path towards the Korea that we know until the 60s. So in many ways, the Koreans followed what the Chinese have now done, just with a 20-year head start, and it shows in their demographics. They're much older. Demographically speaking, they may have a very, very long lifespan, and that's great, but they stopped having kids in numbers 50 years ago. So the decline there is extreme. Now, they're only now, in this decade, hitting that mass retirement point, and it's such a smooth slide from the 70s down to the children that this has been a golden age for the Koreans, because they've had all kinds of people who are above age 40 but younger than 65. And that means that they're some of the most highly skilled workers in the world, but there's no one to carry the torch for them moving forward. Now, under normal circumstances, I would say that this would be the end of Korea as a nation, but the Koreans have shown from time to time over the last 75 years that they can ignore the laws of physics to get things done. So I don't want to condemn them. If anyone can come up with a super secret backstage plan to make this work, it's going to be them, and I hope they're kind enough to share it with the rest of us, but I don't see how it works. Okay. Japan began aging a lot sooner. But Japan, because they started aging before the turn of the previous century, has had a lot of time to culturally adapt to this adjustment. So yes, demographically, they are the world's oldest country, but they are no longer the world's fastest aging one. They've taken a number of steps to encourage people to have kids. They've made it easier to move into the countryside or the smaller towns. They've generally made life a little bit easier in the workplace on women as well. And they have adjusted their entire manufacturing and investment strategies to relocate the sort of jobs that really take people away from family time to other countries. I mean, they did this for multiple reasons, the whole reshoring trend.
Do you think the drive towards automation in Japan is
automation is part of that, but the Japanese really have moved a lot of their productive capacity elsewhere. Toyota's mantra is build where you sell. And in doing that, they've made alliances with countries with healthier demographic structures, which has allowed their people a little bit more flexibility. And so actually, among the Northeast Asian 4 countries, Japan has by far the highest birth rate now. They're still aging. This is still a problem that will have to be dealt with over the decades to come.
But
they're no longer the first country that's going to get there. That's Korea.
So do you think Japan has done the best job of making efforts to mitigate these demographic problems?
Globally, yes.
Globally, okay.
I think the only other country that even comes close might be Sweden or France.
Okay. And you also mentioned that Japan, as far as the economic industrial base, they've made agreements with the U.S., which is likely to sort of take them under their wing in this era of deglobalization.
No one takes Japan under their wing. Japan's too big.
Fair.
But Japan has gone out of their way to strike a series of deals with both sides of the political aisle in the United States. So when you look at things from the American point of view, we like the Brits, we like the Aussies, most days we like the Kiwis, and of course, Canada's along for the ride. That's the Anglo Alliance. And we're in the process of wrapping our minds around the fact that Mexico is as much family as Canada is, and we're getting there.
Right, yeah.
Japan found a way to buy themselves into that inner circle. They're the only country that we didn't approach. They approached us, and they found a way to make it work. That hasn't been done before, and I don't know if it's replicable, but it is a hell of an achievement.
Then, so let's talk about Taiwan. Where does Taiwan fit into this potential arrangement, or what do the fates have in store for Taiwan as far as economic or demographic issues?
So Taiwan has a little bit more elbow room than either Japan or Korea per capita, and as a result, their demographic slide has not been as abrupt. In addition, they started industrializing and urbanizing a good decade and a half before the Koreans, so they've had a little bit more time to adjust. Now, it's still on a sharply negative track, but if you think of the Koreans as having a big bulge in their demographics in the 60s, with the Taiwanese, it's in the 40s. So even if all of the negative trends in the aging and the urbanization and the low birth rates continue, it's still going to be another 20 to 30 years before Taiwan is in a Korea-style situation. And that means barring, nukes and wars and all that good stuff, that Taiwan is definitely, of the Northeast Asian four, the one that's going to last the longest.
Good news for Taiwan. The potential of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, given China's serious political and social problems and the general deglobalization going on, is conflict more or less likely in your view, let's say in the next few years?
I think conflict is less likely. When a country decides that they want to invade a neighbor, they don't just wake up on an idle Thursday and throw the switch. They plan for it. They build their military around it. It takes years, if not decades, of planning. And in doing it that way, countries have to make certain assumptions that guide their planning as they reshape their militaries for the task at hand. In the case of the People's Republic of China, there are four big assumptions. Assumption one is that the war would be easy. And then they look at the Ukraine war and they realize that the Ukrainians only had 8 years to prepare, whereas Taiwan has had 45. And you can walk to Kiev, but you have to swim to get to Taipei. So, assumption one's out the window. Assumption two, Russian weaponry is great. So let's steal all the IP from the Russians, buy the floor models, reverse engineer them, and then build out our own versions of them and equip our soldiers with $3 trillion worth of new gear. And they're now having some serious buyer's remorse because Russian weaponry in the field is just not performing. Assumption number three, no one will care. Once we launch the war, everyone will just stand back, let it happen, and then just admit that this is the new reality and they'll just deal with it. The Russians are now under more sanctions than all countries in all regions throughout human history. And if you were to take the same sanctions that are on the Russians, put them on the Chinese, oh my God. I mean, Russia's a flawed system. It's corrupt. It's inefficient. But it's a massive producer and exporter of food and energy. China is the world's largest importer of both, and it imports 80% of the inputs that allows it to grow its own food. You take the sanctions that are on Russia, put them on Beijing, and you get a deindustrialization collapse complete with a famine in less than 6 months. So everything that the Chinese thought they were preparing for has fallen apart, but it's the fourth one, I think, that really terrifies the Politburo. The idea of the boycotts, not the sanctions, just companies deciding to walk away from hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in the Russian space, expecting no compensation, just deciding this is not what we want to be part of. There is no concept of citizen agency in Beijing, certainly not at the top. They don't even have a way to process this. So every assumption that they have made for 40 years, they now know is wrong. And they don't even have the capacity intellectually to start over because they don't have the people who can think outside of the box at all.
But there's the issue that you've already mentioned is if Xi Jinping gets the idea into his head, is there anyone there that would, say no?
There is not. PLA? And that is the risk, is that if Xi or an overeager bureaucrat just decided to pull the trigger just because, the war would happen. It would be the end of modern industrialized unified China. I have no doubt about that. Okay. But if you're like me, and you think that for demographic, financial, and strategic reasons that the Chinese system is in its final years anyway, then there's something to be said for choosing the time and the place and the nature of the conflict so that you can at least write the local history version of it. And that might just be enough for the CCP to remain in power. And if you can do that for the low price of 300 to 500 million dead Chinese, it just might be worth it.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. I recently saw a video of yours where you discussed how the U.S. is slowly sort of pulling away from this the global trade order that's been established over the last 50, 60 years. And you mentioned that it might take a serious national security scare that would bring U.S. interests back towards an idea of like, we need to keep our investment in this global order. Would Taiwan meet that criteria if there were a conflict?
I don't think so. If we have a war in Taiwan, obviously the world is going to lose its top-end semiconductors, but that's a relative. The 10 nanometer and smaller semiconductors that Taiwan dominates, it's 80% of production globally. It's a small sliver of the market. You're talking about less than 5% of the total, and that we're probably going to lose anyway. One of the things about semiconductors that most people don't realize is the degree to which it's an ecosystem. So the wafers, as a rule, come from Japan, and some of the machinery from Korea, and the designs from the United States, and the lithography from the Netherlands, and the lenses for the lithography from the Germans, and the lasers for the lithography from California. You get the idea. Yeah. It takes a village. Okay. And if one piece of that falls out, Taiwan's done. Because there's no one out there who can replace it. This is the result of 50 years of industrial specialization in a dozen different locations. There's no backup. That's one of the reasons why when the Biden administration decided to kill the Chinese semiconductor sector, it was so easy because it only took one country removing support. And now with the Dutch and the Japanese online, it's three. So, it really is over. Now there's an asterisk there. There's, papers that you can write on the details. But this sort of environment that allowed us to push the boundaries where Taiwan was the forge that brought all these pieces together, this was never going to last. Okay. So the Taiwanese semiconductor industry in its current form will not last regardless of the overall American position. Okay. So, enjoy it while you can. And always keep in mind, you can use top-end fab facilities to make non-top-end wafers and semiconductors. So it's not that semiconductors are going to vanish from Taiwan, but the pushing the boundary, as have become used to associating Taiwan with, that is very close to the end, and was going to be close to the end, regardless of what happened with the United States or a war with Taiwan, a war with China. For the United States to be sufficiently scared to pick up the mantle of global leadership again, it's got to be something that can theoretically hurt the mainland. So 9/11, of course, was the excellent example, because if it wasn't for 9/11, we would have been on this path 15 years ago.
Makes sense.